All right, welcome to another episode of Safer Communities Canada. We are really honored to have our special guest, Dr. Tanya Sharpe, in the house. All right, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I mean, this is a space where we try to really have some authentic conversation with people who live it, who are doing it in community and with community. And you are someone who is doing that on so many levels, particularly in the community safety space, coming from the U.S., making Canada your home. We're going to really chop it up and get into those details and learn your story and learn about how you're creating change and doing advocacy and activism, which aligns with some of the work we're trying to do here at YAAACE through our recently launched Center for Community Safety and Roots of Violence, with this podcast being one of our knowledge mobilization efforts.
Let's go.
All right, so, the resume is very long, so here is the elevator pitch version of it. Dr. Tanya Sharpe joined the Wentwash faculty in 2018 at University of Toronto, currently in the social work department, after being an associate prof at the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Social Work for 11 years. Right before we started recording, we were actually talking about The Wire, which, as you know, had its roots there. So Dr. Sharpe is a community-engaged researcher, passionately committed to communities to thrive in the face of homicide violence. Dr. Sharpe's research provides scholars with social-cultural factors, a responsive framework designed to understand the ways those social-cultural factors affect Black survivors of homicide victims and how they cope with grief and despair. She utilized her framework to develop culturally appropriate psychosocial interventions, really reflecting her social work background. And she is the founder and the director of the Center for Research and Innovation for Black Survivors of Homicide Victims, aka The Crib. Got an Instagram show that goes on. We'll talk about that, so do check it out. And the recipient of many prestige awards, but most importantly, a well-respected research given the area she's researching, particularly, of course, with the Black communities and Black identity. So thank you, and thanks for joining us in the studio.
Thank you so much, Artavan. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, we're honored. We're really excited. So we'll get right into it. Maybe you could tell our listeners really what inspired you and how did you end up in this space? And I asked that because I never saw myself getting a PhD. It kind of just happened based on where life took me. So what kind of moved you to kind of become Dr. Tanya Sharpe and finding your focus area of focusing on homicide, particularly, how Black families and communities are impacted by it?
Yeah. It's interesting. I was just before coming here, I was talking to doctoral students who were asking me similar questions. So it's kind of fresh in my brain. And it reminded me of the fact that I come from a long line of both social workers and educators, right? And so that duty to serve others is very much rooted in who I am and how I was raised. That's first and foremost. But specifically, the focus on Black survivors of homicide victims really came about by being honored and privileged enough to work side by side with Black survivors of homicide victims in Boston, Massachusetts, where they told me about their stories of survivorship. Anybody who's seen me talk, I actually start with that story over and over again because it was profound. It was profound to the beginning of my journey in this area of research, because when I listened to their voices and heard their stories of survivorship that they trusted me with, I was deeply moved. But also it forced me to then go to, as researchers do, go to the literature at that time. I won't tell you how old I was, but it was several years ago. Go to the literature and say, okay, what is the literature saying at the time I was in the United States about the disproportionate reality of Black people? We were counting the numbers in the United States, where we said, okay, Black people disproportionately experience homicide, and then Latinos were second in the United States. But when you look in the literature, their experiences were not reflected in the literature. So then I said, so then what who's making the decisions, who's informing the decisions about the policies that dictate the services they get, who's conducting the research that dictates the service, that there's a disconnect.
Yeah.
So I took a leap of faith. I quit my job. I don't advise that for all of you listening, but I quit my job. And I entered into a PhD program at Boston College. But I was very, very focused that this is not work, but it's a calling for me. I'm very clear about that. It's a calling to be of service to Black communities, so that they will be better off than when I've entered them.
Amazing. Well, we're glad to steal you to Canada. What brought you to Toronto, Canada?
Oh, I get asked this question a lot. Oh my gosh. All right, I'm gonna tell the story out of bed. Stay with me. I'm gonna tell the story. So essentially, I was at the University of Maryland School of Social Work in Baltimore, where in Baltimore experiences roughly 25 murders a day to people that look just like me, right? And I was on sabbatical at the time. And a colleague of mine who's a coworker, faculty member at U of T, saw him at a conference. He was like, "Hey, come hang out, have dinner, meet my dean." Da, 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 da. I was like, "Okay, I don't know, I'm chilling." And I met the dean, and the dean was like, "Wow, what do you do?" And I told her what I did. She's like, "That's fascinating." She's like, "We don't have anyone who's really doing work in this area, research area, and there's a significant increase in gun violence in Toronto. Why don't you just come up and do a talk?" And I'll never forget the day before my talk, she called me and she said, "I just want to let you know we had to move your talk." And I was like, "What do you mean? The date, the talk?" She said, No. She said 150 something people from the community have registered, and we don't have the capacity to fit them in the space. So I said, okay, note to self, there's something going on here that at least researchers U of T, that y'all ain't tracking. You're not listening to what the community is saying. The community is saying we need this space. So I did my talk, came back, flew to Baltimore, didn't think anything of it. 2 years later, that same dean at the time is asking me to have coffee, asking me to chill, have conversations. I didn't pick up what her agenda was. I was just like, I've made a new friend. And finally she said to me, "Tanya, would you ever consider moving to Toronto?" And I said, "Absolutely not." And she said, "You're not even going to think about it? Like, what's up with that?" And I said, "Listen, I'm not the Black Messiah." I said, "But I just told you 25 murders a day happen in Baltimore to people that look just like me. And I've made a commitment to that community. And I'm not willing, that's a non-negotiable for me. If I made a commitment, I'm not willing to leave it." And she said, "I'm not asking you to." Then a light bulb went off for me. If we look at the data in terms of what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Canada, what's happening in South Africa, what's happening in Jamaica, it's really not where you are, but it's how you move, right?
Yeah.
It's about opportunity. And I said, okay, all right, if you're willing to, I need to listen to that. If she's saying I don't have to give up the work that I'm doing in the US and can continue to do that work in Canada and then build in Jamaica and South Africa, that's a game changer. So I basically went back and said, okay, let's talk. I said, here's my vision. I want to build a hub, the first hub of its kind that's focused on culturally responsive research, policy, and practice for Black people, doing it in partnership with communities. Could you support that? Could you give me research assistance to work with that?
Yeah.
I work with communities. Are you going to support that? Because that's a whole different space working in academic settings, as you and I know.
Yeah.
And she said, yes, yes, and yes. So I took a leap of faith, got in my car with my dog and drove across the border, and here we are.
So, we're big on basketball here. It sounds like you got recruited with a full scholarship.
Yes.
That's great. On the show, we're trying to break down some complex theoretical things for the everyday listener. And for folks who don't know, I knew of you and your work, in the community safety space, but I ended up teaching a course at the social work department.
I miss you.
Yeah, at U of T, and it was called Social Work with Community Organizations, where I was always talking about YAAACE. And so that's where our friendship began. And, he's amazing. He's an amazing teacher and scholar. Thank you. I appreciate it. So you use the word disproportionate, which I think is becoming a lot more common in this space now compared to overrepresentation. And so how do you define disproportionate in your work? Because I think we want to get into the nitty gritty, because a lot of times these terms get thrown a lot, I think, but love to hear your thoughts on it.
See, you just you hit on something, so I'm gonna go in.
Yeah, give it to us.
So real talk, we use disproportionate to often describe the overrepresentation of a thing in academic space. But I think the central crux of my work is uplifting the fact and the reality that it's not disproportionate by coincidence, right?
Yeah.
It is really a structural issue that we're talking about here. It's not something that just kind of happens in terms of Black people being murdered at significant pandemic proportions. It is by design, right? And so for me, yes, I'm talking about disproportionate, but I'm also bringing into the fold and the conversation that there are structural inequities. If you are deliberately depriving somebody of clean drinking water, access to sustainable foods, if you are depriving them of fair wages, affordable housing opportunities, that these structural inequities are inherently violent. And we should not be surprised then that that is also leading to different forms of violence. We should not be like, oh, what's happening here? And so that is really the foundation of my work. When I talk about disproportionate reality, I really challenge people to not pathologize individuals for the experience of homicide, gun violence, etc., but to really look at the structural systems that are in play that are contributing to this reality for Black and brown people.
Yeah. I mean, well said. You use pathologize. Some people use deficit thinking, kind of blaming the cause on individual factors rather than looking at those structural pieces. I was recently talking to someone about trauma, and I was like, well, why don't we talk enough about institutional trauma, intergenerational trauma?
I really enjoyed listening to that that podcast.
And so those are really the pieces. So thank you for that. The other piece I wanted to ask you was, a lot of the work you're doing is talking about kind of culturally reflective and culturally responsive services or programs that offer services, particularly for Black families or Black individuals, whether they're justice involved or simply grieving and are impacted by a homicide. How do you define, or in your work see that term? What does culturally reflective mean? And what are some characteristics that make a program or a service culturally reflective, particularly when we talk about marginalized and the Black experience?
So thank you for that. I think one of the things that I really uplift into the conversation when I'm talking about culturally responsive is that Black people are not a monolith. Right? You can't just be like, we're doing a Black program. And then that is very clear. So when I talk about culture, there's a culture of youth. There's a culture of a neighborhood. There's a culture of age. There's a culture of ethnicity, right? People's experiences in Jamaica, Trinidad, or Chicago, there might be some similarities, but there's some distinct differences. And so what I'm talking about is a complex array of things that allow us to get to that space where we're positioning ourselves to be more responsive and aware, culturally aware, and caring in that space. So it's about cultural humility, for example, not cultural competency. Because if you think that you're going to take a class or do a EDI certificate and master something, you are missing the mark, right? So it's about cultural humility, that every time I go into different space, when I moved to Canada, when I moved to Toronto, I didn't know a whole lot. So I know some things, but I had to sit there in the space and with individuals and listen and ask a lot of questions, ask for support if I didn't know certain things. That's a culturally humble space, right? That there are experts in the community that can contribute to our work together. And then how do we then manualize, for lack of a better word, how do we create training opportunities that will inform interventions so that the people that we're trying to serve are a part of creating those solutions, and we're also creating sustainable opportunities. I mean, the goal for me is after the money dries up, after I have long gone off this earth, there are other individuals that have been impacted by the work, that are better positioned to actually lead it as well.
It's, I mean, amazing. I mean, I definitely agree with everything you're saying. And I want to kind of shift this to kind of some of the things you are doing. You had a really amazing and insightful report, which, we've read extensively at YAAACE and cited in some of the things we're doing with the Center for Community Safety and Roots of Violence, the social determinants of homicide, right? I mean, a lot of people maybe are familiar with the term the social determinants of health, right, as an umbrella term, kind of looking at the root causes that contribute to your longevity, your health. But you kind of narrowed that to a niche of what are the social determinants of homicide? Like, walk me through that. What does that mean, and what did you look at in that report?
Yeah. So, so I have to say, during COVID, COVID was the precipice, really, of where this concept was birthed, and as a result, I have a class, Social Determinants of Homicide, and I have a book proposal that's really talking about social determinants of homicide specifically. But it was, if we are able to somehow look at the confluence of COVID, or the impact of COVID, particularly on Black communities, and look at it through a public health lens, look at it as how did this disease spread? Then why aren't we able to take that same approach and look at homicide and grief as a disease that is spread based upon structural inequities, right? So really, social determinants of homicide, that through that lens allowed me again to start to think about being over surveillanced, disproportionate reality of mass incarceration, again, unequitable access to fair housing, education, those kinds of things, and how those are contributing factors.
Yeah.
Those are inequities. Those are determinants to your well-being.
Yeah.
And if we have inequity in those spheres within Black communities, then there's something here in terms of how it contributes to the experience of homicide, right, in Black communities. The other thing that I also talk about here is that I need people to understand is that it's not necessarily about an individual who has experienced the murder of a brother, a sister, a father, a cousin, but it's also watching the brutal erasure of you over social media streams to people that look like you, played over and over again. That sort of that collective trauma is significant and profound, but we're not developing interventions. So where does that grief go, right? So it's just really looking at these inequities as pathways, if you will, to carry the disease, I think, of violence and homicide in Black communities.
Yeah, I mean, I love the way you explained it, looking at all those dynamic pieces, but through that phrase, the social determinant of homicide, you're able to take the listener or the reader to kind of examine that. Like, the erasure part doesn't get talked about enough, right? It's always more the embodied experience. But I think, you're looking at kind of what do we do after the incident happens, both for the folks directly impacted, the family unit, the community itself, the groups that are impacted. So I think we need a lot more discussions and focus to understand that, which I think you are doing that, and you're advocating for it through the CRIB, which once again is the Center for Research and Innovation for Black Survivors of Homicide Victims. So how, some of the work of YAAACE and the CRIB and what you're doing, pollinated was, in Toronto, the city of Toronto, as you know, was looking to bring a violence intervention program using that culture reflective piece. And, we looked at the United States, cure violence, advance peace. And so it led to the creation of Towards Peace, which is kind of a made in Toronto for Toronto programming. We're piloting it and we're implementing it now here in the Jane and Finch community. Zaya Brown is doing it, I think, twice in Rexdale, and the expansion is going to Scarborough this year. And you've been involved with that in different ways. And, the program really values the lived experience of people who are then going and supporting folks who are impacted by the violence, whether that's homicide or other forms of serious violence. And that trust and relationship building is a big part of this work. So when you think about your research when it comes to, helping families or individuals constructively grieve and heal, what role does that lived experience or trust play?
It's everything. It's everything. So when I say I'm a community engaged researcher, I mean it. So there are a couple of things. I don't go anywhere that I'm not being invited into that space because I honor where people are. The other thing is that let's have some real conversation about the fact that once sight unseen, when people don't know me, there is the University of Toronto, a university system that, just like any other system, has done harm to Black communities. And so for me, it starts with those relationships first. So people know how I am not trying to do harm. I am trying to partner with community agencies, partner with people with lived experience to be able to create interventions that are informed based upon that experience, but also uplift the gifts and skill sets that already exist in communities to be able to address it, right? So when you talk about lived experience, to me, it's everything. We have a program that I created called the Neighborhood Ambassadors Program. Those individuals have a certain amount of skill set because they are people with lived experience 9 times out of 10. They work with youth in communities, but they've also gone through intense training in terms of research ethics, data collection. But now they are paid to work across all of our research projects, developing the program, developing the research questions, collecting the data, and they're working for other research centers and labs.
Wow.
Right?
Very impressive.
So again, the idea is that, I'm interested in working my way out of business, right? So that they can go on and have money in their pockets, have sustainable income, but they also are working across different systems and creating credible opportunities for community engaged researchers like myself. So that to me is everything. The crib was developed again by listening to the voices of individuals' lived experience and positioning ourselves to respond to what they say that they need. And so every project that I am involved with, that the crib is involved with, is really dedicated to that purpose. Our collaboration together, the crib and YAAACE, is dedicated to that purpose. I watch the way that you all are responding to the needs of the neighborhood. And so you want to work with like-minded individuals who are moving the same way you move, just like that. You see what I did there?
Yeah, just like that. I saw that ludicrous reference. No, I mean, as you said, you want the relationship to be reciprocal. And when people, I think we started with terminology, but it was also speaking about our values. Yeah. And when the values of an org aligns with yours as a researcher on a personal and an institutional level, it makes it that much easier. But, this work is, of course, not easy. Mm-hmm. And, I'm familiar with my research I had that you also get a lot of resistance or people who maybe don't believe in the cause. 100. So this is kind of like a 2-part question. On one level, on a personal level, how do you cope with that? And kind of the no-sayers or the people who you have to almost justify why this is an issue that should be resourced, should be funded. And then on a larger scale, how do you strategically try to navigate to turn a no into a yes?
It's funny. I was going to start with the question. I've now learned that every no is a possibility for a yes, which is how I've positioned myself to survive. And I think I'm going to answer it in two different ways. One is I got a lot of no's starting out. I got, I remember one person in particular said, well, why don't you go study individuals who are surviving gunshots, because that number is significantly larger
Than homicide. Okay.
The number of survivors is significantly smaller. And I was like, I literally, I was like, so what do I tell that mom who I just met last week, who just fell into my arms and is, mourning the murder of her second son?
Like quantifying the pain and how that can be detrimental. Right? Yeah.
Is that life not significant? That just threw me. So I got a lot of no's, a lot of folks that don't get it. Even when here I had someone say, so why should I invest money? Why? Because not understanding, they were like, you're talking about individuals who are suffering the murder and the death of a loved one. I'm interested in prevention. But what I've learned, and in that moment, it caused me to say, I've just given you the breakdown of the global grief and despair that Black people experience. So our preliminary data, for example, is saying that African Caribbean and Black folk here in Canada experience the homicide of a loved one at least 3 times in their lifetime. They experience it within their neighborhoods here in Toronto, in the GTA. They experience it with loved ones who live in the United States, and they experience it as a result of murder of someone in their home country. So imagine the ripple effect of that grief. And I was like, what am I saying that this person is not picking up on? And I realized that, number one, I needed to do a better job of saying how the work that we're doing is both preventative and intervention. That if you think about the number of individuals that are struggling to survive the murder of loved ones, and that they have no support system to help them in their grief journey, where does that grief go? It doesn't always go to places of retaliation, but it can, right? So the work that I do is both prevention and intervention in that sense. And I'm going off on a tangent, I'm sorry. But sorry, just keep going. Say the question again. Sorry.
You know what? I forgot the question as well.
Because we're just enjoying it.
I mean, it's such a good conversation. But you know what? I think I'll ask a follow-up question. Yeah. I mean, I remember the question. I guess, how do you cope with it?
Oh, that's important. Yeah.
Like, you kind of talked about institutionally, but on a personal level, how do you, you said, that comment rubbed you the wrong way. Woo. You got the no-sayer. Yeah. So how do you regroup? How do you strategize to now go back and keep at it?
Thank you for the recap. So one of the things is just real is that I think about the survivors who have honored me with their stories of survivorship. And I think about the fact that if they can get up and survive another day, surely I can too. That's just real. I have good folk around me, both on a personal and professional level, that actually see me and can check me. They check me and they're like, Tanya, Dr. Sharpe, you doing way, how are you today? You're doing a little bit too much. So that's really important while you're doing this work, this heavy work, this privileged work, but it can be heavy, right? Because you are in spaces constantly. My research is about traumatic death and dying. I am one of very few Black scholars in these spaces. So carrying a lot of weight in different ways, trying to mentor junior faculty for success, trying to mentor Black students for success. So, you just have to have your good folk around you that can be a circle of support, that can hold the space for you. Yeah. I mean, that's so important. because the demands keep coming, and I have a hard time saying no. But it does take its toll. So I think it's the support, but also the motivation, because there's urgency, right?
Yeah.
All I do is need to turn on CTV News or and recognize how important it is. And I know you feel that too. Like it's just it's relentless, but you do have to take pauses. You do have to take breaks. And when you are still pushing yourself, have people around you that say you need to take a break. And I also think that what's also important is, I've realized, is thinking about what the next generation. Like, so pouring into those individuals,
Yeah.
training those individuals, the next generation to move this forward. So that's really, I think, the ways in which I try to cope with it, for sure.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that and being vulnerable, because, we always say being vulnerable is a form of strength, and modeling
Yeah,
that, you're able to, people kind of appreciate that authenticity, and
Yeah,
kind of you model what you ask of others, and I think
Yeah.
that's important.
Thanks.
I mean, you mentioned the word kind of holding space or even curating space, and I'm reminded of kind of how research is a form of activism in terms of how it holds space for stories to be told, for certain statistics to be amplified or not overlooked.
Yeah.
And so I think you are holding space through what you do as a researcher. And I'm reminded of, with the center here at YAAACE, we're trying to do knowledge mobilization to align with that. This podcast is an example of that. We're planning to do a symposium at the end of the year to bring folks to have these conversations from a holistic lens that really amplifies the experience of people with the lived experience. And we're hoping to do a book as well, which you're going to be a part of and contribute.
This guy.
Planting the seed. But, you've done some really unique projects. Right now we're working, with our amazing media team and filmmaker Rico King around a film looking at the impact of violence, parents who've lost children. And you recently kind of wrapped up a project that involved film and photography. So can you walk us through that and how that idea came, and how was it? How did you recruit the research participants? I was there at the launch when you had it, and it was really insightful and it was powerful. So tell us about that project.
Thank you. Yeah, the project's called Invisible Wounds. I absolutely love merging the arts with the work that I do. I just love it. I think it makes it more accessible to folks, but I also selfishly have a good time.
Yeah.
And so this was a digital storytelling project, was funded by Shirk Foundation, where we kind of, if you think about it, there were two buckets for us. It was one, looking at and talking to Black survivors of homicide victims throughout the GTA, targeting some of the neighborhoods that experience high rates of gun violence and homicide victimization, and having focus groups and interviews with those folks. And then out of that larger group, having them go through an intense training with our partners at Story Center to learn how to create their own digital story. Now, the question about recruitment is actually how the Neighborhood Ambassadors program was birthed, because those participants, again, we did a lot of snowball sampling. So we had an advisory committee. We were like, look, can you help us recruit? Snowball sampling in terms of like, if you recruit someone and they participate in the focus group, you ask that person, do you know somebody who might be down to talk to us as well, right? So we kind of did that. And then it just mushroomed out of there. I think we ended up with about 30 to 60 individuals that we spoke to. And then 10 to 12 individuals out of that group decided to do the digital story. And what's really cool about that is they developed their own script. They learn how to talk about their own script, and they learn how to create their own film. They might take video, they might shoot video. Some of them created their own music as a backdrop. It was just amazing. But out of that, basically what happened was we have a short film called Invisible Wounds, and then afterwards we have a panel discussion with those same participants. And I tell you, when you talk about motivation, when you talk about coping, some of the the stories that they talk about or the impact of being a part of that process, and most of them were young Black men saying they'd never talked about this before, how they felt about it, that it was something that they didn't realize where the anger was coming from, that they felt like they were supported in this process. And it was just profound creativity, but profound, I don't want to say healing, but just recognition of the grief, how it manifests, and how best to deal with it that keeps them safe. And so as a result of that, we've done now 3 screenings of the movie. We were accepted to present it internationally. So we presented it in Baltimore, Maryland. Shout out again to Baltimore, Maryland.
Let me get that invite next time to come along.
With the panel. And they were there. And what the community has asked of us, again, is that we do it with younger folk. So we have another project called In the Aftermath, which is actually doing it with younger kids as well. So I absolutely love that project. Love it.
And you know what? You make a really good point, and I want to kind of connect the storytelling part to kind of grief and coping and healing. So let me expand on that before I throw some questions at you. So, when I think about, they say the most effective therapeutic program is Alcohol Anonymous. Now, when they break it down, it's because typically 2 things happen when you go to a group therapy. All right. Now, let's say instead of alcohol, we replace it with dealing with homicide. All right. When you go to group therapy, 2 things happen. 1, you recognize you're not alone.
Yeah.
There's other people who are experiencing these emotions, what you're going through, these thoughts. The other thing is, in a group therapy, everyone is at a different point in their healing trajectory. So you realize there can be hope to be better than what you're experiencing today. So now when I think about dealing with grief and loss, bring it back to our conversation of being impacted by homicide, I engaged in some work around the process of engaging pain and suffering as a form of like critical pedagogy, or being critical of how to process it. And I narrowed it down to 3 things. When something traumatic happens, you try to forget it as a survival mechanism.
Absolutely.
Right? And we see that a lot in our circle of friends who've dealt with homicide.
Yep.
And then after forgetting, you try to kind of remember it. All right. And you choose how to remember it. And eventually you can get to this stage, and not everyone gets there, but you retell that traumatic experience in a way that is empowering, in a way that is actually, you recognize it makes you who you are and your perspective. So I think a lot of the work you're doing through that storytelling is almost trying to walk people through that stage from wanting to forget to how do you honor those people they lost. And we also, when we think about violence at the community level, particularly we think about Jane and Finch and other racialized communities, a lot of people, of course, have that anger.
Of course.
And when you're not able to grieve properly or in a culture-reflective way that is conducive, you maybe gravitate towards anger or reciprocal shooting of getting revenge in order to maybe experience healing. Maybe you assume that process brings you healing, right? And this community is really impacted by that history of reciprocal shootings. So how do you see this healing work? How can it be done within the Black community in ways that moves people along this spectrum of not resorting to violence as, healing or a institutification outlet of that anger, to more constructive ways of bettering the community and to ending the violence in a sustainable long-term way? It's a loaded question.
No. And there's so many. I had so many points. First and foremost, if we consider the relentless frequency in which Black people experience their demise, there is no post. There is no post. I firmly believe this. There is no post-traumatic stress disorder.
You're always in it, literally.
People.
Yeah.
There's no post. And that is significant. So we have to get people to understand that, which is why I'm always like, here are the numbers. Here's what this means. Here are the survivors. On average, each victim has 7 to 10 family members. I'm trying to tell the story because it means that you have tons and tons of communities that are just operating at a hypervigilant state constantly.
And that's like amplifying what
Right.
statistics or stories. Like you're poking a hole in that post-traumatic kind of discourse and logic, right?
Yeah. And so, you know, that is not sustainable.
Yeah.
So what you see a lot, and I'm sure you see this particularly with a lot of the students that are at YAAACE, is that our kids then get diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, or they get pegged as being aggressive when they're operating at a hypervigilant state because of what is happening outside these doors.
Like looking over their shoulder, even on a walk, right?
On a regular basis, right?
Yeah.
So there's that. Some of the things that you uplifted in the conversation remind me of the model of coping that I developed, which found that, Black folk are relying on specific coping strategies, as a result of both the trauma of anti-Black racism and the frequency in which they experience the homicide of a loved one. I feel like that's another podcast. Happy to talk about that more. But some of the things you talked about was maintaining a connection to the deceased. This is why we see tattoos. This is why we see decals on cars. This is why we see corners with balloons and candles. I want you to know that my loved one's life was significant.
And honoring it,
right? Then we have collective coping and caring, where people are gathering together and they're talking about what's happening, but they're talking about it inside a family structure. Why? Because I don't want you outside communities, outside services to further stigmatize me. I don't need you to make assumptions that it was a drug deal. I don't need you to make assumptions that it was gang related, right? So we're just going to keep this 100 inside the family and not talk outside the family. But if you think about the frequency, that family is constantly overburdened with that complexity of grief, right? Yeah. So there's so many elements. Concealment. I'm not going to tell you what's going on because I don't want you to know what happened if there was illegal activity. So there are all kinds of elements to this that are complex and continue to place weight on systems internally, which is why we have to uplift that really authentic conversation into this context, and then position ourselves to create interventions that won't further stigmatize, that won't further shame people. That's the pathway forward. The other thing is this. There aren't stages of grief, research several years ago talked about stages of grief. I used to remember seeing that on the movies. You got to accept the first stages. You got acceptance, That's right. That's right. Yeah. It's a grief journey. It's a grief journey, and I think as a result of that, there are sort of spectrums of reaction that ebb and flow. Right, to your point, on Tuesday I could be sort of, maybe wearing some jewelry that my loved one wore and feeling extremely connected and centered. But on Thursday, it's their birthday, or it's the anniversary of their death, or someone who looks like my son is just murdered down the street, right? So it sets me back, or, you know what I mean? So it just ebbs and flows. And so I think what that means is we really have to have a fundamental understanding about the experiences of Black people, what that looks like, what are the coping strategies, but also what does that mean for us in terms of the language that we use, how we hold space for folks, all of those things. One of my fundamental learning when I started doing this work, I'll never forget, and I tell this story all the time, is I call her Edna, and I went up to a survivor whose son had just been murdered very early on in my career. And I said, "I'm so sorry for your loss." And she looked at me with disdain and said, "I didn't lose my son. He was taken from me." And that changed my world. So what I do with my research is I'm training individuals about what to say and what not to say, how to hold space. What should that look like? And it really goes back to how we started this conversation, which is listening to the people with lived experience. Yeah. I firmly believe that communities will always tell you what it needs as long as we just listen.
Or we curate the space so they can be heard, because a lot of times they're telling us, but
Yeah.
we're not listening to them, or we're
100.
not listening in a way that actually we're hearing what they're saying.
100.
Okay, so I'm mindful of time, so I'm gonna try to give us
I'm having fun.
two questions. I know time is flying by.
Stop.
You know what? I'll start with this one, which is more about the embodied experience of, you know, when I ever watch the news and there is, you know, a tragedy of a death, because anytime we lose a life, it's a tragedy. I think a lot of times from a news aspect, we get into this thing of like, were they a good kid or a bad kid? Were they a good person or a bad person? To your point, were they a drug dealer? Did they have a record or not? And I think a lot of times that actually becomes detrimental to looking at the social determinants of homicide. The question should be, what gravitated this someone to be at this place at this time, and what these, if there were negative decisions or poor decisions made, what contributed, you know? And more interestingly, how could it have been prevented, you know, through the school system, through the health system, through the access to program or caring adults? How could it be prevented? And I think we don't do enough of that. And you know, I'm reminded kind of how do we look at those same situations, but shift the angle we look at it to find solutions. And then it's going to lead into my last question, which will be around like, where are the gaps and how do we try to come up with solutions to really tackle those systemic pieces that you mentioned? So you mentioned about people, for example, honoring life, right? Life lost, right? And, you know, I always remember, I can't remember exactly, you know, I went to a lot of funerals growing up, and someone, at some point, someone said it's a celebration of life. It's not a funeral. And that always stuck, that concept always stuck with me. And every time I go to different funerals, it's always interesting to me how they're organized. Like, what is the focus? Of course, there's going to be grief, there's going to be crying and anger, but some are always set up as a celebration of life to kind of say, hey, even though they left us too early, let's look at how they contributed, the impact of the relationships, regardless of age. So how can we kind of shift the conversation beyond deficit thinking, as you said, you know, or pathologizing families, individuals, and communities, and shift the conversation to say, what is contributing to this form of institutional trauma? And then more importantly, once we're able to identify it, how do we mitigate or reduce or really change it?
I mean, seriously, Artaban, that is
a loaded question,
that's a
right?
huge.
Well, give me one or two practical things. Like, I want us to go from the theory to like, give me the practical thing. Like, think of, let's say here's a family, they just lost their child. How do we step in to be supportive and not re-traumatize them?
Yeah. So one of the things I also want to mention that you did uplift into this conversation is we do not acknowledge the victim offender overlap. Right? We don't talk about the fact that that oftentimes, to your point, when you talked about watching something on the news, so forth and so on, that individuals are both survivors of surviving the murder of loved ones, and they also sometimes, not all the time, but may also be perpetrating it, right? But that signals to me, if that's a reality, that we're not doing a better job, and we should be doing a better job, to your point, in terms of solutions of capturing trauma histories.
And that reminds me of like the analogy of the bullied becomes the bully, right? Because to your point, like the same risk factors that can make you a victim can make you the perpetrator of violence or
and
homicide.
Again, I would be remiss if I didn't leave this podcast saying, and that's not just we're not just talking about the interpersonal violence, but we're also talking about the structural violence. We're talking about police brutality. We're talking about all of these things that are manifesting in violent, traumatic ways. But that signals to me that we've got to do a better job of capturing trauma histories, right? So some of the really creative stuff I'm seeing, I think both here and in the US, training barbershops owners to capture trauma histories of individuals and deliver the intervention, nail tech salons, hair salons. How are we training? I remember back in the day when I was working at Connecticut Children's Medical Center, we trained medical professionals to do screenings for intimate partner violence. Why can't we do the same thing with trauma histories? If we consider the frequency in which it's occurring, we've got to capture that trauma so that the historical context of trauma and how people are experiencing it, to know when we can intervene, right? When and where we should be intervening. So I think that's the data has to be collected. I also think it signals to us in terms of concrete solutions for survivors of homicide victims. It signals to us has significant policy implications. One of the projects that we led at the crib was the Survivors of Homicide Victims and Mental Health Project with CMHA, where we interviewed Black survivors, Indigenous survivors, racialized survivors of homicide victims, and their service providers to find out what's hurtful and helpful. Out of that research came 10 policy recommendations, which we're about to publish, that really say this is what victim services for Black survivors of homicide victims, Indigenous survivors of homicide victims needs to look like. It means that if we know, for example, that our relatives are not necessarily relatives related by blood. I have aunties and uncles who aren't my blood relatives, but you can't tell me that's not fam, right?
Yeah.
If that's the case and they're fundamental to my upbringing, as a result, they should not have to provide a certificate or birth certificate showing my connection and family lineage to get access to mental health services. Right?
Comes like family by being your support network, by loyalty versus always looking at it through that lens of genetics.
So there are all kinds of implications to this. There are policy implications and practice implications that if we don't address it, again, and to me, that's doing policy in a culturally responsive manner. That's doing practice in a culturally responsive manner. If we're not doing that, then we are re-victimizing the victim. And those are some concrete things that the research that we're generating is showing that can better position us to make sure that we're responding to the needs of communities.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of, what Charlene Grant from Parents of Black Children told me. A lot of times when she's going into the rooms looking at educational policies, a question she asks is, when was the policy written? Who was at the table?
There you go.
Was there anybody that looks like me as a Black female? And what kind of amendment or revision is required for it to really meet the needs of the community?
That's right.
All right, so I'm going to end off, and I think, we've covered so much ground. So I'm going to take it back to like a practical scenario to end with.
All right.
Here is someone listening to this podcast or watching it, and let's say they recently had to deal with grieving or losing someone they love, right? And they're being built up with anger and frustration, and they don't really know how to name it, how to respond to it. What advice and insight do you give them within this 48-hour period of experiencing that loss?
Two things come to mind. One is don't ever let anybody tell you not to be angry. Anger is a normal emotion. And you were having a normal reaction to that which is abnormal. No one should experience the murder of their loved one over and over again. So you were having a normal reaction to that which is abnormal. And so to me, that's the first thing that I would say is that, don't let anybody tell you not to be angry. You should be. The second thing is it's really about what do you do with that anger that keeps you and others around you safe. So being able to identify those spaces and places that can hold the space for your anger with respect and acknowledgement, but being able to really help support you through the grief process. But that's the first and foremost thing, that don't let anybody tell you that your feelings are not valid, because they are 100%. But then going to spaces and places like YAAACE, like a close family member or friend, where you can actually be able to talk to someone or find access to services that can support you is key. The third thing I would do is say that you're not alone. You know, you are not alone in this, even though I know it feels so very lonely. I will share with the audience publicly, you know, I know that feeling because I am a survivor. And so, but know that you're not alone in this. And I think I learned that from, again, the participants from Invisible Wounds saying how invaluable it was to know that someone else was thinking the same thoughts. They were thinking and feeling the same things. We weren't talking about it, right?
You don't have access to them really sometimes.
We weren't talking about it. So those are the first and foremost things that I would say.
Wow, powerful. And it's okay to ask for help. You're not being soft.
100.
You know, you're not being a soft man for asking for help,
at all.
because that's part of your healing journey.
Absolutely.
Right. And so I think that's kind of trying to counter that culture and the representation we see.
100.
Because I think like anger and outbursts are so much amplified in films, and when we watch representation on TV, it's really hard to say there's another way of expressing it that is okay, and that's part of kind of amplifying or centering different representation, which is part of this, and then the policy pieces you mentioned. So you know what? It's been a pleasure. I wish we had another couple of hours to chop it up further.
Just
but
means you have to invite me back again.
You know, we're going to keep the collabs going between Dr. Tanya Sharpe and YAAACE and the Crib. It's something that is going to be a long-term thing. Any final words, insights, mic drops before we wrap it up?
Oh my gosh, the pressure. The pressure. I mean, it's just, at the end of the day, I think it's just, I feel so honored and privileged to do this work. And like I said from the very beginning, it isn't really work. It's a calling for me. I have been called to serve the community in this way, and I won't stop doing it until my last breath. And I also recognize that the space that I occupy, again, as a Black woman, where you don't see, unfortunately, many of us in academic spaces or leading this work. And I think that what I've learned to come to the conclusion about is that my existence is an act of resistance. You know, but I cannot do this work without you, community members that are listening. So thank you for taking a chance and partnering with me. I appreciate it.
And we hope, continue to be you, because we appreciate you, the way you authentically present yourself.
Thanks.
And on that note, that's another episode of Safer Communities Canada. We hope you tune in with the next episode, where we'll continue to have these conversations with amazing folks like Tanya, who are doing some really, really innovative work to really change systems for more sustainable and equitable outcomes. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much.